It was the year 1944. The Pacific theater of World War II had already become a vast battlefield of steel, fire, and endless sky. For Japanese pilots, the once unshakable pride of the rising sun, the war had entered a stage they had never truly anticipated. In the early years, Japan's Zero fighter planes had cut through the air with unmatched agility, feared by every opponent. But by now, by this fateful year, the sky itself had shifted. Above the ocean waves, the roar of American engines was no longer just a sound. It was a promise of dominance, of relentless pursuit, and of skies that belonged to someone else. When American aircraft formations appeared on the horizon, they did not come as a few isolated machines. They came like thunderheads rolling across a battlefield, waves of heavy bombers, armored fighters, and aircraft carriers beneath them, endlessly feeding the storm. For Japanese pilots, climbing into the cockpit no longer meant facing a fair duel of skill. It meant rising into a storm they could not escape. Many would watch from their bases as American planes blackened the sky, too many to count, their silhouettes stretching from horizon to horizon. The Zero, once a weapon of fear, was now fragile against Hellcats, Corsairs, and Mustangs, machines built with greater speed, armor, and firepower. And so each mission became a desperate act of survival. Each takeoff became a prayer. The air itself, once the domain of Japanese pride, had turned into a nightmare theater where American dominance was absolute. Under the grey morning skies of 1944, the Pacific theater was no longer the same world it had been just a few short years earlier. When Japan had entered the war, its Zero fighter stood as a symbol of unchallenged dominance. Sleek, nimble, and lethal, it could outturn, outclimb, and outfight nearly anything the Allies sent against it. For the pilots of the rising sun, flying the Zero was not merely a matter of national pride. It was an extension of their identity, their skill, and their courage. In those days, they believed themselves untouchable. But war is relentless, and war changes faster than belief. By 1944, the once feared Zero was no longer the king of the skies. The balance of power had shifted. In the hangars of American factories, far from the front lines, new machines were being born, machines that would erase Japan's advantage and shatter the myth of invincibility. The Americans had studied the Zero carefully. They had captured models, dissected them, and understood the secret of its lightweight design and breathtaking maneuverability. What had once been admired was now studied clinically, reduced to numbers and weaknesses on paper. Engineers realized what every Japanese pilot already knew, but did not speak aloud. The Zero was fast and agile, yes, but it was also fragile. A single burst of heavy fire could tear it apart. It had no armor to shield its pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks to keep it alive under fire. It was a sword that cut swiftly, but one that shattered easily when struck against a shield. The Americans would build not just a sword to answer it, but a fortress with wings. From the factories of Grumman came the F-6F Hellcat, a machine born not only to fly, but to kill Zeros. Its thick armor gave pilots a chance to survive hits that would have incinerated their Japanese counterparts. Its 650 caliber machine guns unleashed a storm of lead that shredded whatever crossed its sights. And when it climbed into the skies, it did so with speed and raw power that shocked those who had grown accustomed to their Zero superiority. Alongside the Hellcat came the Corsair, with its distinctive bent wings and roaring engine. It too was faster, tougher, and more powerful than the fragile fighters Japan clung to. The Mustang, arriving in force over Europe and later the Pacific, extended American reach even further. These were not mere planes, they were declarations. For Japanese pilots, the transformation was like a nightmare that unfolded slowly, then suddenly all at once. At first, there were whispers in the ready rooms, stories of new American fighters spotted in battle, of Zeros that never returned. Veterans, men who once returned from sorties with victory tallies painted on their fuselages, began returning with silence in their eyes. The duels were changing. What had once been evenly matched contests of maneuver and daring now turned into desperate struggles where even the most skilled Japanese ace found himself outgunned and outlasted. The Zero still turned more tightly in the air, yes, but what did it matter if the American plane could climb above it, dive faster, and deliver killing blows from angles no Zero could counter? The shock came not just from the machines, but from the sheer numbers. American skies seemed to produce fighters in endless waves. A Zero pilot might take down one, sometimes two, but where one fell, 5 more appeared. The pilots of the rising sun looked upward and saw the storm approaching, a storm born of factories. Thousands of miles away, where day and night the machines of war rolled off assembly lines with no pause. Japan's industry could not match it. Every Zero that burned was a wound that could not be healed, while every Hellcat lost was replaced almost immediately, a new one roaring into the air before the smoke of the last had faded. By 1944, Japanese pilots spoke less of victory and more of survival. The ritual of climbing into the cockpit became a ritual of resignation. They strapped themselves into aircraft that felt increasingly like coffins, knowing full well what awaited them in the sky. The balance of power was gone. Their once proud fighter had become a relic, forced into duels it could not win against enemies it could not outlast. And still, they flew, because they had no other choice. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly, and it weighed on their shoulders every time they saw the horizon darkened by American formations. What once had been a domain of glory was now an arena of despair. They looked at their machines, at the thin metal skin that rattled under stress, at the controls that once felt sharp and alive but now felt outdated, and they knew. They knew the tide had turned. The Zero was no longer the master of the skies. It was prey, and the hunters came in waves. The sky above the Pacific in 1944 no longer belonged to Japan. Where once their Zeros had danced freely across the clouds, engaging in daring one-on-one duels, the air had transformed into a stage dominated by overwhelming American force. For Japanese pilots, the change was not subtle. It was terrifying, a gradual erosion of confidence that gave way to the stark reality of helplessness. They had been raised to believe in the Bushido spirit, to fight with honor and courage, no matter the odds. Yet what unfolded before their eyes was not a battlefield of equals. It was an arena where technology, numbers, and industrial might had tilted the scale so far that bravery itself became meaningless. The horror began with the sound. Deep, thunderous vibrations carried on the wind, long before the aircraft themselves could be seen. American bombers flew in massive formations, each one bristling with guns, each one a fortress in the sky. Their shadows crawled across the ocean and land, blotting out the sun as they passed. Protected by swarms of fighters, Hellcats, Corsairs, Mustangs, they seemed untouchable. A single Zero attempting to penetrate that wall was like a moth diving toward a bonfire. Japanese pilots who once took pride in their agility and precision were now faced with an impossible reality. It was no longer about skill, but about sheer survival. On the ground, villagers and soldiers alike looked up with dread. From their airfields and bases, Japanese pilots could only watch as the dark formations passed overhead, wave after wave, heading deeper into the heart of their empire. For many, the most haunting moments were not in the cockpit, but on the earth below, standing helpless, seeing the black dots in the sky multiply until the entire horizon seemed alive with engines. They knew where those planes were going. They knew the fire that would follow. Cities, supply depots, factories and ports, each would feel the unrelenting hammer of American bombing campaigns. In the early stages of the war, Japanese aviators had often flown with confidence into such skies, eager to prove themselves. But by 1944, the duels had turned into slaughters. The bombers flew not in scattered clusters, but in disciplined, coordinated waves, each protected by rings of fighters circling like vultures. For a Zero pilot, approaching such a formation was an exercise in futility. Long before they reached the bombers themselves, they would be intercepted by layers of American aircraft, machines built heavier, faster, and deadlier than their own. The Japanese pilot, strapped into his thin-skinned Zero, faced the storm, knowing that his odds of breaking through were slim, and his chances of returning alive even slimmer. The terror was compounded by the realization that the bombers themselves were no easy prey. The B-29 Superfortress, introduced in force by the Americans, represented an entirely new kind of threat. High-flying, long-ranged and armored, it could strike Japan's cities with impunity. Even when Japanese fighters managed to reach them, the B-29s fought back with lethal force, their gun turrets raining fire in every direction. For Japanese aviators, it was as though the sky itself had been weaponized against them. Inside the cockpits of Zeros and other outdated fighters, young men gripped their controls tightly, their faces set in grim determination. Many were barely out of training, rushed into combat with little preparation. They looked ahead at the towering formations, engines screaming as they climbed higher, and they knew the futility of what they were about to attempt. Yet still they went. They banked, dived and rose, chasing the enemy into a wall of gunfire. Some never made it close enough to fire a single round. Others managed to land a hit, perhaps even cripple a bomber, only to be consumed moments later in a blaze of tracer fire. The skies of the Pacific became a theater of horror, not because of the absence of courage, but because of the overwhelming imbalance. Japanese pilots were not cowards. They fought with every ounce of spirit they had left. But courage alone could not erase the sight of endless bombers blotting out the sky. Courage alone could not silence the roar of engines that shook the earth below. For the men in those cockpits, the battlefield had become a vision of despair. One nation's dwindling fighters clawing at the heavens while another's industrial might filled the skies with machines that seemed endless. What struck the Japanese pilots most deeply was the sheer relentlessness of it all. Even on days when they shot down a bomber or managed to scatter an American formation, the victory was hollow. For every bomber that fell burning into the sea, there were 10 more still pressing forward. For every American fighter that spiraled downward trailing smoke, replacements would arrive from carriers or distant airfields. The Japanese had no such luxury. Each loss was permanent, irreplaceable. Every friend who failed to return was not only a hole in the squadron, but another painful reminder that their nation was being bled dry in the skies above. From the perspective of those watching from the ground, the horror was equally sharp. Soldiers, civilians, and fellow airmen saw the blackened skies, the relentless bombing raids, and the tiny dots of Japanese fighters rising to meet them. They watched as the duels unfolded, small, fragile planes pitted against the roaring might of American formations, and too often they saw their countrymen fall in flames, their sacrifice swallowed by the immensity of the storm. The skies, once a source of pride, had become a place of mourning, and yet perhaps the greatest horror was not in the fighting itself, but in the helplessness. Pilots on the ground who were not assigned to intercept missions often stood frozen, eyes tilted skyward as the formations thundered past. They could see the contrails stretching for miles, could hear the deep rumble that shook their bones, and they could do nothing. The feeling of being powerless before such a force was worse than combat itself. It was the knowledge that the sky no longer belonged to them, that every mission was not about winning, but about slowing an inevitable defeat. In the end, the skies told the story of imbalance, one nation forced to watch its dominance erode. Its pilots pushed into hopeless battles, while another nation extended its reach with terrifying precision. The horror of Japanese pilots was not born from fear of death, but from the sight of overwhelming force blotting out the horizon, wave after wave, with no end in sight. It was the cruel realization that the war above the clouds had been lost long before the last dogfight had even begun. Bravery had always been the currency of the Japanese aviator. From the moment a young man stepped into training, he was taught that the cockpit was not only a seat of war, but a shrine of honor. He was told that his skill, his courage, and his devotion to the emperor would make him unstoppable, even in the face of overwhelming odds. In the early days of the war, that belief had seemed true. Pilots returned from missions with stories of glorious dogfights and victories that lifted the spirit of an empire. But as the war dragged on, the reality grew darker. By 1944, every Japanese aviator knew the truth. Their bravery had not diminished, but it no longer mattered. The machines they flew were fragile, the enemy was stronger, and each mission carried a shadow of near certainty. The courage of the pilot could not erase the fact that his Zero, once a feared predator, was now prey. Every morning began with rituals that carried the weight of finality. A pilot would rise before the sun, often after little sleep, and prepare for what could be his last day alive. He would tighten his flight suit, check his gear, and eat a simple meal that tasted more of duty than nourishment. The walk to the airfield was quiet, the air thick with unspoken words between comrades who understood what few dared to say aloud, that many of them would not return. Yet they did not flinch. They strapped themselves into machines that had once made them proud, machines that now rattled under stress and crumbled under fire. And they prepared to face the impossible. Once airborne, the fragility of their situation became painfully clear. The Zero was agile, yes, capable of turning tighter circles than almost any American fighter. But that advantage came at a terrible cost. The plane had no armor to protect its pilot, no heavy shielding for its fuel tanks. A single burst of 50 caliber rounds from an American fighter could rip it apart. Worse still, the Zeros were outgunned. Where American fighters carried heavy, reliable weapons, the Japanese relied on lighter cannons and machine guns that struggled to bring down the heavily built American machines. Each dogfight was a desperate gamble, a wager of skill against overwhelming firepower. The pilots themselves did not lack courage. Many were scarcely more than boys, their faces still holding the softness of youth, yet their eyes hardened by the knowledge of what awaited them. They launched into the skies, not with the expectation of victory, but with the determination to fight, no matter how hopeless. The duels of the early war, sharp turns, dramatic dives, daring climbs, had become something else entirely. Now they were fights for survival. Each second measured not in glory, but in whether the thin metal frame of the Zero could withstand the next barrage of bullets. Some Japanese pilots tried to cling to their training, using every ounce of agility the Zero could offer. They dove sharply into cloud cover, hoping to shake their pursuers, or turned in impossibly tight arcs to outmaneuver the heavier Hellcats and Corsairs. But even when they succeeded momentarily, the numbers always worked against them. For every American fighter that was evaded, two more appeared. For every bomber formation scattered, dozens more loomed on the horizon. It was not a fair fight. It was attrition, and the Japanese knew it. Inside the cockpit, the desperation was palpable. The roar of engines, the rattle of machine guns, the hiss of tracer fire cutting past their wings. Every moment was a reminder of mortality. Heads gripped the controls tightly, sweat stung the eyes, and the stomach turned with every violent maneuver. Yet there was no hesitation. Time and again, pilots dove headlong into formations of bombers, knowing full well that the odds of reaching them were slim, and the odds of returning were slimmer still. What once had been pride had indeed become sacrifice. For those who survived a sortie, the return to base was not one of triumph, but of exhaustion. They landed their battered aircraft with trembling hands, stumbled out of the cockpit, and often walked silently back toward the barracks. Conversations were hushed, eyes hollow. The victories they achieved, shooting down a bomber here, crippling a fighter there, did little to change the overwhelming tide. They knew it. Everyone knew it. Yet they continued. They fought not because they believed they could win, but because their code demanded it, and because not fighting was unthinkable. The emotional toll was immense. Each pilot carried the weight of comrades who did not return, men whose planes burned in the sky or crashed into the sea. Empty bunks in the barracks became grim reminders of sacrifice. Letters from families back home, filled with pride and hope, cut deeper than any wound, for the men knew they could not fulfill the promise of victory those words carried. Their nation asked for miracles, but the skies offered only attrition and death. Yet even as despair grew, courage never disappeared. There were stories of pilots who, outnumbered and outgunned, pressed into battle again and again, determined to give everything for their homeland. Some turned to desperate measures, choosing to ram their planes into bombers rather than allow them to rain destruction on their people. It was a tragic evolution of bravery, a transformation of pride into sacrifice. But it revealed the spirit that still burned in the hearts of men who knew the end was near. What courage could not overcome, however, was reality. The fragility of the zero, the endless numbers of American fighters and bombers, and the sheer might of American industry had created a war that no amount of bravery could win. The Japanese pilots knew this, and yet they fought anyway. That was their tragedy and their honor. They became symbols not of triumph, but of sacrifice. Men who rose into the sky, knowing they were already defeated, yet refusing to surrender. Each mission carried the same bitter truth. Survival was unlikely. Each takeoff felt like a farewell, each battle a dance with death, each landing, if it happened at all, a fleeting reprieve. Bravery had not vanished. It had only changed shape. No longer was it the pride of being the hunter, the master of the sky. Now it was the silent acceptance of being hunted, the grim determination to rise again into a storm they could never escape. Behind the roar of every American aircraft that dominated the Pacific skies in 1944 lay something far greater than the skill of a pilot or the sharpness of a machine. It was the immense weight of the American war machine, a force not measured, only in dogfights or bombs dropped, but in the ceaseless turning of factory wheels, the endless stream of ships carving across the oceans, and the staggering ability to project power across thousands of miles. For Japanese pilots, the true horror was not simply the sight of a Hellcat diving from the clouds or a B-29 Fortress rumbling overhead. It was the realization that behind those machines stood an empire of industry and logistics that Japan could never match, no matter how much courage or sacrifice its aviators displayed. The aircraft carrier embodied this terrifying imbalance. For centuries, navies had defined the balance of power upon the sea, but in the Pacific War, the ocean had been transformed into an airfield. American carriers turned rolling waves into floating fortresses, each capable of launching squadrons of fighters and bombers that extended American reach far beyond any natural boundary. A Japanese pilot taking off from an island airstrip knew he faced not just the aircraft already in the sky, but the certainty that more would come, wave after wave, from mobile runways that moved invisibly across the vast ocean. The carriers, themselves bristling with anti-aircraft guns and protected by escorts, were nearly untouchable. To strike at them was to court near certain death. And yet their planes never ceased. Factories back in the United States made this dominance possible. While Japan struggled to replace even the most basic losses, American production seemed limitless. Workers in Detroit, Seattle, and California built aircraft, not by the dozens, but by the hundreds and thousands. The American pilot who fell in combat could be replaced with both a new machine and a new man, trained and ready, while the Japanese pilot who perished left behind a hole that could not be filled. Japan's resources were stretched thin. its industry fragmented, its capacity to keep pace utterly broken. The war machine that fueled American skies seemed almost mechanical in its relentlessness, a tide of metal and manpower that could not be stopped. This reality translated directly into the battlefield. When Japanese pilots rose to meet enemy bombers, they did not face just a formation of planes. They faced the weight of an entire industrial empire. Every time they shot down a Hellcat, another took its place. Every time a B-29 was damaged or lost, more arrived in steady streams from distant factories. It was as if the Americans had found a way to make the sky itself endless, an inexhaustible reservoir of planes and men. To Japanese eyes, this was not a fight. It was a flood. And floods cannot be fought. They can only be endured until they wash everything away. The contrast became painfully visible on the ground. At Japanese airfields, pilots walked past lines of weary, battered aircraft, patched together from salvaged parts, their paint chipped and engines coughing from overuse. Mechanics worked tirelessly with dwindling supplies, cannibalizing one machine to keep another in the air. The pride of earlier years, when squadrons gleamed with pristine Zeros and skilled crews, had given way to improvisation and desperation. Meanwhile, American airfields, whether on land or aboard carriers, were marvels of organization. Planes stood in neat rows, gleaming and ready, their engines fueled, their weapons loaded, their maintenance precise. From the perspective of a Japanese pilot, the comparison was crushing. Even more devastating was the sight of massed American squadrons in flight. While Japanese fighters often launched in handfuls, clinging to the hope of disrupting the enemy, the Americans appeared in disciplined formations that seemed to stretch endlessly. The scale of it was overwhelming. Hundreds of planes circling in the skies, coordinated with frightening precision, each pilot part of a larger machine that operated with mechanical efficiency. It was not simply a battle of individuals anymore. It was a demonstration of industrialized warfare, where every man, every plane, every bomb was a cog in something vast and unstoppable. The psychological weight of this could not be overstated. Japanese pilots, bound by honor and courage, still climbed into their fragile fighters. But they carried with them the knowledge that they were not merely facing other pilots, they were facing the American war machine itself. The courage of one man or even one squadron meant little against an enemy whose resources seemed infinite. Every mission was shadowed by the realization that they were outnumbered, outbuilt, and outlasted before the first shot was even fired. The American war machine extended beyond planes and carriers. It was in the logistics too. Fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, all flowed across the Pacific with astonishing reliability. Japan, starved by blockade and stretched to its limits, fought battles not only against enemy aircraft, but against scarcity itself. The American pilot flew knowing he had the best equipment, plentiful resources, and a steady hand of support behind him. The Japanese pilot often flew knowing his fuel was limited, his weapons unreliable, his survival uncertain. The contrast gnawed at morale, deepening the despair that already haunted the skies. As the months passed, the truth became undeniable. Japan could not match America's capacity to produce, sustain, and replace. The skies had become a mirror of that imbalance, a place where every dogfight and bombing raid reflected the greater reality of a war already decided by factories, carriers, and supply chains. The pilots of Japan fought bravely, but they could not fight against industry. They could not fight against time. Each mission became less about victory and more about slowing the inevitable, resisting for as long as their frail machines could hold them aloft. For the Americans, the skies had become a domain of confidence, of overwhelming power. For the Japanese, they had become a place of sorrow, where courage met futility, and where the war machine they faced was as vast and unstoppable as the ocean itself. In the shadow of that machine, Japan's pilots realized that no matter how fiercely they fought, the sky no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the factories, the carriers, and the endless tide of aircraft that rose from the west, blotting out the sun and drowning their world in thunder. For the aviators of Japan, nothing cut deeper than the realization that the skies, once their proudest domain, had been stripped from them. At the outset of the war, the rising sun soared high, its zeros carving arcs of dominance across the Pacific. The air had felt like theirs, a realm of daring duels and celebrated victories. But by 1944, the reality had turned into a nightmare. Each mission carried not the thrill of hunting, but the dread of being hunted. Each horizon revealed not opportunity, but overwhelming opposition. Slowly, painfully, the Japanese pilots understood that what had once been theirs had been stolen, and that they were powerless to reclaim it. The sky itself, once a canvas for their triumph, had become a graveyard. The loss of the skies was not an overnight event. It was a slow bleed of hope, drawn out across months of unrelenting combat. Every new encounter with American aircraft chipped away at the myth of Japanese air superiority. At first, pilots still clung to the belief that their skill, their training, their willingness to sacrifice might tip the balance. But as Hellcats, Corsairs, and Mustangs cut through their squadrons with brutal efficiency, the illusion crumbled. No matter how tightly they turned, no matter how bravely they dove, the Zero's fragility betrayed them. The thin frame that once made the plane light and agile now rendered it vulnerable to the withering firepower of American guns. The skies no longer yielded to courage, they yielded only to power. Each takeoff carried the weight of resignation. Pilots walked toward their aircraft knowing the odds, their faces etched with calm determination that masked the dread inside. The rituals of preparation, fastening straps, checking gauges, adjusting helmets, had become routines of farewell. They knew that for many, the mission ahead would be their last. When the engines roared and the planes lifted from the ground, it was not a climb toward glory, but toward the jaws of inevitability. From the moment wheels left the earth, every Japanese aviator carried the shadow of defeat on his wings. The dominance of American air power left Japan's pilots with fewer and fewer options. Missions were no longer about gaining superiority, but about stalling the unstoppable. Their assignments shifted toward desperate attempts to disrupt bomber formations, to buy a few moments of reprieve for cities and islands below. But even these efforts ended in futility. The bombers came in waves too vast to stop, protected by fighter screens too thick to penetrate. The Japanese fought with the desperation of men trying to hold back the tide with their bare hands. Each death, each flaming wreck became another marker of a nation's decline, written not in ink, but in smoke trails across the sky. The emotional toll was as crushing as the physical losses. Every pilot carried the ghosts of his fallen comrades. The sight of empty bunks in the barracks, the knowledge that friends had gone to fight and never returned, weighed heavily on those who remained. Survivors bore not only their own scars, but the burden of remembering. Letters from families arrived, filled with pride and faith in their sons' victories, words that cut into the hearts of men who knew those victories were gone. They could not admit the truth to their loved ones, that the rising sun no longer ruled the heavens, that the war above the clouds had already been lost. Still, they flew. Not because they believed they could win, but because surrender was unthinkable. Each mission became an act of defiance, each attack a statement that though the sky was no longer theirs, they would not abandon it without a fight. This was the essence of their tragedy: courage without hope, sacrifice without reward. The Bushido spirit carried them upward again and again, even when logic, strategy, and reality all said there was nothing left to gain. They became warriors not of victory, but of resistance, clinging to honor in a sky that had turned hostile, and the sky itself seemed to mourn with them. Wreckage smoldered in the sea, flames licked across runways, smoke hung like veils over cities shattered by bombs. The sun, once a symbol of Japanese power, now set behind horizons lined with American formations. The heavens, that had once echoed with the nimble whine of Zeros, now thundered with the heavy growl of American engines. For Japan's pilots, every glance upward was a reminder of what had been lost. Some tried to transform their despair into final acts of sacrifice. Kamikaze tactics emerged not as strategy, but as desperation, an admission that the skies could no longer be contested conventionally. For many, crashing their planes into American ships was the only way left to make an impact, the final expression of a warrior's devotion when all else had failed. These acts, while feared by their enemies and honored by their homeland, were also symbols of how far the empire had fallen. Where once Japanese pilots had ruled as masters of the air, now they flung their lives away in fire, trading themselves for fleeting moments of destruction. The loss of the skies mirrored the decline of the empire itself. What had begun with swift victories and triumphant marches had become a desperate struggle for survival. The pilots, once the spearhead of Japan's expansion, became the guardians of a collapsing defense. They watched from their cockpits as their nation shrank beneath them, island by island, city by city, until even the homeland itself came under relentless assault. Every mission became a battle not for conquest, but for the preservation of what little remained. In the end, the Japanese pilots knew the truth. The skies no longer belonged to them, and they never would again. Each mission was a testament to their bravery, but also to their powerlessness. They had lost not only the air war, but the very symbol of their pride. What once had been their realm of glory was now their battlefield of despair. Every takeoff was a step toward inevitable death. Every landing, when it happened at all, a hollow reprieve. The sky that had once lifted their nation high had betrayed them. Or perhaps, more painfully, they had lost it through no fault of their own, but through the crushing weight of an enemy whose resources and machines were simply too great. Their courage, their sacrifice, their unwavering spirit could not change the truth. The rising sun no longer shone in the heavens. It was eclipsed, consumed, and buried beneath clouds filled with American bombers and fighters. The sky was lost, and with it so too was the dream of victory.